All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started now. So first off, I want to welcome everybody to Archives Month. This program is part of the MARAC Virginia Chapter's Archives Month celebration in October. This program is supported by funds provided by the Friends of the Virginia State Archives, a 501c3 organization. Visit them at friendsofvirginiaarchives.org. This afternoon's program will be presented by VCU's Caroline Meyers. As a brief introduction to Caroline, she graduated from VCU with a BFA in Sculpture and Extended Media and is currently pursuing her MLI at Valdosta State University. Caroline has had continuous library experience in the Greater Richmond area over the past 6 years, working with researchers, students, and the public to connect them with information resources. Earlier this year, Caroline curated an exhibit titled Zines from the Pandemic and Beyond, using self-published materials from VCU's special collections and archives to demonstrate the history of zine-making. Today, Caroline will discuss the history of zine-making, how zines can be used as teaching tools, and how archives can play a role in the zine community. Without further ado, I'll turn things over to you, Caroline.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks everyone for being here so much. I'm really looking forward to talking to you all today. Like Emily said, I am here at VCU Special Collections and Archives in Richmond, Virginia, and I started here in the winter of 2022. So I'm coming up on 2 years here. And in this presentation especially, and also in my everyday job life, I draw a lot from my relatively recent experience as an undergraduate art student here, because I think archives and particularly VCU's collections have a lot to offer art students, and I think zines are a great way to engage them. I also want to add that since VCU is an academic library, I'm definitely coming at this from like a teaching perspective. So how can we engage students with zines that are like every day in our collections, and also like thinking about classroom settings where either zine production or zine distribution or zine browsing can enhance the educational experience. And we'll get into, I notably highlight a couple projects from art students who have engaged with archives later in the presentation, one of which is me. So I'm really looking forward to kind of expanding on how those two worlds connect. And so just to start, I'll talk a little bit about VCU's zine collection, which you can see the finding aid for here, which is a little bit unorthodox, I think, in terms of the way you might access a zine collection, because it's not, it's just not super browsable. The dedicated zine collection that we have is roughly 700 zines, and in this finding aid, they are listed in alphabetical order under collection organization. And if we know the year that they were published, that's listed, but a lot of them are undated. So this is often the first thing we offer to people that are coming to look at zines. You can get an idea of the content of these from this list, but it isn't the best. And it's not something that we aren't actively collecting in this dedicated zine collection. This zine collection was begun in the 1990s. And it's especially strong in mid-2000 zines. And that is largely due to Selena Williams, who is still an organizer of the Richmond Zine Fest and was a longtime special collections employee in the 2010s. Much of this collection is due to her work soliciting zines for the collection at Zine Fest. But it isn't the only place in the collection that we have zines. We also have significant collections of comic arts. So that includes comic books, original comic art, comic reference materials, as well as graphic novels. And there are things in that collection that are zine-like, especially mini comics, self-published comics. We've got self-published content across lots of our different collections. And then zines that we purchase currently tend to go into our book art collection, which is another large collection, high demand from art students here at VCU. And they fit in folders, so they get filed in with other kind of more typical book art pieces that are flat and can fit in folders. And those materials are cataloged in the main VCU Libraries catalog. So a lot of times I'll direct students to do keyword searching there to find things that they're interested in. But this is like the main zine collection. And I wanted to note that I still have a lot to learn about this collection. I think probably a lot of us that work in archives feel that way about our collections, but having only come on 2 years ago and then also with a lot of other staff in my at VCU that are relatively new within the last year or so. We're still doing a lot of work to understand who has worked on our collections in the past, how these collections were established. And so all of this to say, my understanding of the collection and the directions I think it would be beneficial for us to take it in are still very much in progress. And I'm really open to, especially after this, hearing from what people do in their own collections or if you have ideas. So I am going to go through talking about the exhibit itself and then addressing practices that we here at Special Collections and Archives are what we're currently doing to engage students with zines and also encourage zine creation and creative response to the archives in general. And then finally talk about what strategies in the future can be for even more deep engagement with these publications. So what you see here, it's gotten truncated to zines from the pandemic and beyond, mostly for just ease of saying, but the full title, it begins Contact Sheets, Prototypes, and Scraps of Paper, Zines from the Pandemic and Beyond. And this exhibit was installed at the beginning of 2023 and is currently up indefinitely, though we are starting to get into more of a groove with our exhibits. So I don't anticipate that it will be up for too much longer as we're starting to kind of get ideas for things that are in line to replace it. But this is the first library exhibit that I've curated. And it was kind of interesting circumstances because it was the first physical exhibit to be put up in VCU Special Collections for a while. Coming off the pandemic, it just wasn't a focus of the department. We were pretty understaffed at the time. And so when I arrived in the winter of 2022, my supervisor at the time was like, hey, we've been trying to get this exhibit concept off the ground. We'd like to do something about COVID-19 and wellness with our book arts or our zines. And it was kind of turned over to me at that point because they could tell I had an interest in it and I had a background in book art. I studied sculpture at VCU, but that's a very open-ended program, as you will later see in this presentation. And while I was a sculpture student, probably the medium that I worked the most consistently in was print and books. So I came in with some background knowledge that helps me support the book arts and zine collections. And the other thing that was nice, but also ended up being a struggle about this exhibit is that there was no real deadline for it. We were kind of just trying to make it happen at the time. So I worked on this I started working on it in March 2022, and then it was finally installed at the beginning of 2023. So I really had quite a long time to ruminate on the different zines and book art in our collection, which is a really valuable experience and probably not one that will be repeated given now that we are working towards developing a more regular exhibit schedule. But all of that to say, that is how this started. This is a poster version of the exhibit that I presented at a conference in April, and I'm showing it because it takes the central text and also highlights 3 specific items with 3 of the strategies that I identified as being relevant that the zines that I featured here used. So I'm kind of just using it as a shortcut to highlight a few of the items that I feel represent the exhibit well. It's also interesting talking about this now because I see things that I feel like since creating this, my knowledge of zines has deepened in a way where I don't know if I would have worded it that way. The first thing being, I found the prompt of wellness interesting and maybe even somewhat problematic because I feel like wellness is often used as a band-aid to sometimes larger health problems or a lack of access to resources in society. And it's kind of, do yoga or meditate. Not that those strategies, not that the things we kind of associate with wellness aren't important, but especially in the context of a global pandemic, it was almost a little bit like to hope that people would find wellness during that was only really scratching the surface of the myriad of social, economic, health problems that surfaced across different parts of the world during the pandemic. So I didn't address wellness so directly as I did. I decided to take more of a focus on zines that had more to do with direct health services. But anyway, I wanted to go ahead and read the entry text just to situate it. The impulse to create and disseminate printed matter with a do-it-yourself ethos has existed for centuries. Though for zines, I wanted to specify that the origin of zines is really located in the 1930s with fanzine culture and science fiction and grew through the underground to what we recognize it today with just a huge variety of subject matter, including personal zines, activist zines, and zines talking about access to health, which are kind of the big three categories that I addressed here. So starting over, the impulse to create and disseminate printed matter with a do-it-yourself ethos has existed for centuries. This took on a new, now I would say renewed urgency with the COVID-19 pandemic as people sought ways to share and access specialized health information, agitate for social change, and engage in restorative play. This poster, featuring zines and book art from BC Library's Special Collections and Archives from the 2000s through the present, asks you to consider zines as tools for therapeutic self-expression and community invocation in the context of COVID-19 and beyond. And this poster was adapted from the larger exhibit. So I want to start off with Low-Key Volume 2, which when I first came into Special Collections and Archives, one of my first jobs was going through things that had been recently purchased and genre tagging them so that when they were cataloged, those tags could go into the record so they could be more easily searchable. So things like risograph printed, accordion fold, like different printing techniques, binding techniques, anything that will make a piece more searchable. And so this one, Loki, was going into the book art collection. And I think this was really at the center of the exhibit for many reasons. One being, I think it's the perfect example of a hybrid between a zine and a piece of book art. It is very much a booklet, but the production value of it is considerably higher than what you would typically expect for a zine. It is risograph printed. The stapled binding is covered by this kind of blue fabric, but it was produced in Bushwick, and it features just like a variety of creative projects from the friends of the people that were making it. And it's the second volume, and it was so a group of people producing this magazine together, but it was featuring all their friends' projects. So flyers from theatrical performances, and literally at its center, and also thematically, there's an interview where they talk about an open mic that was going on in Bushwick that was called The Palm. The Palm was the name of the open mic, as well as the name of the location where it was happening, which was basically someone's backyard. And in this interview, the organizer of the open mic, whose name is Dane Manella, talks about how liberating it's been to be able to do this kind of experimental open mic with his friends, and how he really feels like just super free being able to do these performances. And I had a very emotional reaction to this when I was processing this, when I was genre tagging this item, because this was published in 2019. And it's the exact, having been someone that was also dabbled in performance-based work as an art student, it's exactly the kind of, well, one, it's exactly the kind of, this is like a common subject matter for zines, right? Like people getting together and documenting a collaboration. But it's also the exact type of collaboration that became so hard over the COVID-19 pandemic. Performers in the theater and otherwise were isolated from each other. So I was, wow, it's so striking to me how it's so apparent here, but it was something that was so quickly taken away from us. And then, so yeah, it was wow. And then just thinking about the connections it had to our collection, because I'm curious about it, I look it up online to see, for instance, if we could track down volume 1. And I find an Instagram page for The Palm, the talent show that's featured within, and it hadn't been active since right before the pandemic. And I don't know about you all, but I feel like there were many Instagram accounts I followed, particularly creative ones that were in that same boat, that went quiet, were super active and then went quiet at the beginning of the pandemic. And I also noticed immediately that there's a link to a GoFundMe in the bio of The Palm, and I follow it. And Hurricane Ida, which I think came in fall of 2021, destroyed their performance space. And so they had this GoFundMe asking for donations so they could, fix up the space and resume their program. So clearly with the effect of the pandemic affecting their output, and then, this added context of climate disaster challenging them, I thought it was really an exemplary piece to talk about the ways that people relate to each other and also respond to struggle. And this piece is what made me start thinking about the fact that obviously there was an uptick in zine making during the pandemic, with people being at home and trying to find outlets for creative work. But it definitely isn't the first time that the strategies, playing, agitating, communicating about healthcare information like this, it isn't the first time it's happened. Like, this is the first time, especially I feel like maybe people in younger generations have been exposed to zine making, but as different societal struggles have evolved over time, people have continuously turned to independent publications to express their views. And so throughout this exhibit, I wanted to look at things that were produced not just during the pandemic that addressed the pandemic directly, but things that were made in the 1990s and throughout the 2000s to really just like take a look at how especially these three approaches have stayed consistent over time. So in this exhibit, I had Loki featured as a great example of playing. It's so bright in its different colors, and it is really just a celebration of the different kinds of art that this one New York friend group's members were producing. And then I had there's a big section of the exhibit dedicated to social agitation. And a lot of zines that came out of the COVID-19 pandemic directly addressed the 2020 George Floyd protests. And this piece, it's called We Must Be Very Strong and Love Each Other in Order to Go On Living, and it's by Sonia Louise Davis. This definitely fits in more with book art than zines, but I would say its content is something that you would very much expect with a zine. It's hard to see in this image, I know, but they're basically a series of diary entries where Sonia Louise Davis talks about observing her neighborhood's response to the George Floyd protests. And then I also featured more kind of traditional, what you would expect, photocopied zines, especially from people in Richmond over the years, articulating their political views. One in particular that I liked was the Wingnut Anarchist Collective, which was a local anarchist collective, and they were based in Northside, and they hosted movie nights, and they had a food pantry, and it was great. And I should have mentioned at the beginning, but I'll be sending links afterwards to these different files. Also, obviously, encourage you to come see the exhibit in person. But so yeah, just a wide variety of things featured. And then finally, in the kind of access to healthcare information section, I've featured a few different zines from the Richmond Reproductive Freedom Project, which I feel like if any zine like represents VCU's zine collections as a whole, it's these, because Richmond Reproductive Freedom Project, it's an organization that provides information about abortion access and then actually can physically intervene and help people access that information and practice. So, and they're still active in Richmond. I'm pretty sure I picked up some of their zines at this year's Zine Fest, and it's just a great representation of typical zine aesthetics, clearly made on a copier, and also just very to the point and direct about giving you information about what goes into accessing an abortion in the state of Virginia. I also wanted to point out on the next section, one of I worked with, we had a couple of student workers at the time, as well as an undergraduate library fellow that made selections for this exhibit, which was a really valuable experience because I feel like it just kind of speaks to the democracy and sharing that's inherent in zines. And it was really valuable to be able to talk to those students about what zines were and what we wanted to represent with this exhibit. So moving on from the pandemic and beyond, I wanted to talk about some of the things that VCU is currently doing to engage our students with zines. The number one thing is making our zine collections available to students as best as possible. And so, like I was saying earlier, that goes beyond just providing them with the finding aid. At the reference desk, I try to speak to them and see what their interests are, show them how to browse the catalog so that they can find relevant zine materials in the book arts collection, and also making then the in-person browsing as exploratory as possible. And one thing I've been thinking about, I think especially after attending this year's Richmond Zine Fest, is how zines, you can get so much more from zines by looking at a big group of them rather than individual examples. So for instance, if people come in and they're, I'm really new to zines, but I hear you have them, I'll usually pull multiple boxes and just kind of let them go through those so they can see as many different types as examples as possible. And I think as a maker, that's something that has tripped me up in the past. I want to make a work, but I don't know if the idea I have for it is good enough. And what is so freeing with zines is that it can be on such a niche topic. Like no single zine can represent the entire history or our entire collection of zines. So I really try and take an active role in making sure students get to look at a variety of them. And now one thing that we've started doing recently is making zines that are informational, that are about our collections, that we can hand out to students. So one you see here, this is a zine that was created by Jessica Johnson, who is a processing archivist here. And So the image you see on the left is the cover of it, and then it has full 8 sheets inside, but it also folds out to the single sheet that you see on the right. And I think it's completely within the language of zines from the underground. People are actually delighted to receive this if we're tabling at an event and we hand it to them. It's been funny to just look at the difference in people's reactions to a more traditional rack card versus something that is clearly handmade and is like a cute little book. And this is another example of one that was made by Catherine Buckley, who's our teaching and learning librarian. This one I particularly like because she's used the images from our collection in a really innovative way to communicate this postcard down here on these buttons. It has all the different areas of our collection, so comics, manuscripts, zines. And I kind of like the idea that we could there's in theory like infinitely many of these that we could make and hand out to people, and it really, for sure, there's information in both of these that is repeated, but the approach is very different and they are actually fun to look at. So I like the idea that there could be a series of informative zines about the collection that are overlapping in some ways, but that are interesting to people just through their different formats. So I wanted to talk about now some student work that engages with archives in a creative way. And some of the outputs here are zines, some of not, but I think this is the kind of activity that is really good to encourage and can, like a zine can be an output of it, but either way. The first example, and this I'm super excited about because I did a reference interview with this student, Taylor Mormon, over the summer, and in putting together this presentation, I wondered how that project ended up. So I reached out to her, and literally just before midnight last night, she reached out to me and she was, yeah, here's a documentation of my installation that I made, and gave me permission to use it today. So I'm really excited that such an exciting project came through at the last minute. But anyway, Taylor is an undergraduate in the sculpture program here at VCU, and she reached out to us over the summer. She had the Anderson is our student exhibition space on campus, and they allow students to occupy their gallery spaces as studios throughout the summer. And she reached out to us because she was saying that she was interested in doing an installation based on the history of the building itself, and wanted to know what materials we had that were relevant that she could feature in an installation. And our university archives are infamously difficult to parse. They're not cataloged publicly. There has to be a lot of staff intervention in helping people find and access things. So I worked with Jessica Johnson, who is one of our processing archivists, to find things in the university archives that were relevant. And so Taylor spent a couple independent research sessions on her own. And then these are images and it was very much an in-progress installation. She said in her email to me that she's still working on, she wants to come back this semester and do more research and basically install another iteration of the project. But it basically appears to be an installation with different found objects from around the building, which for context it was originally the library of RPI, and it's just a very old building, and it's controversial on campus because there's no elevator, and yet it is the main exhibition it's the main exhibition space for students for MFA, theses, undergraduate, senior shows, and it's just not accessible. And people have been advocating for a long time for a new building, but it hasn't changed. And I'm getting to the part where she has a map with the content from the archives, but as you can see, it's just kind of like a meditation, rumination on the history of this building and the things that are literally in the walls. And it appears to be a map of the layout of the building. And now you get to images from the VCU archives themselves. This is a piece from University Archives that was it was back from the 1970s, and in it said that the building was basically unfit for use, and yet it still continues to be used. So this is, I just feel like, a really exemplary interaction between a student who is creatively minded and is using the archives and grappling with the history of the campus in order to create their work. Just getting caught up here for a second. And also the title of this, Mining the Gallery, Excavate, it's an explicit reference to Fred Wilson's Mining the Museum, which was a significant installation, like in the long history of artists engaging with archives further, in which he curated objects from the Maryland Historical Society and juxtaposed them to surface histories of slavery in Maryland. And I then wanted to, it was good that she shared her work with me in time, because I didn't want to just feature my own work, but me being an art student was very much my entree into archives, and I was kind of working with them before I even really knew what an archive was. But in short, when I was an art student, I was interested in getting some kind of research funding for the summer, and I became really interested in the art historian Marilyn Stockstad, who is significant as an author of an art history survey textbook. It's Stockstad's Art History. It's one of the major ones that is still used today. And I became really interested in her and the process, like what it meant to have your scholarly work dedicated to the creation of a textbook. So I applied for funding to visit, and this was 2018, she had recently passed in 2016. So I applied for and received funding to travel to the University of Kansas, where she had done her life's work, and interview her colleagues there about what her life was like, as well as visit their archives where her personal papers had just been deposited. And they were completely unprocessed at the time. And it's funny because looking back, I made every faux pas that every new archives user makes for the first time. I reached out to them. They were, let us know what boxes you want. And I was, all of them. I don't really know what I want. And then when I got there, was overwhelmed by the number of boxes that I actually had to go through. But this was my final product and I really went into it with, I want there to be a creative output of this. So I gathered all these, just a ton of content from her personal papers. And I was really looking for things that had her hands, so things that she had written or photos of her. And I just collected as much stuff as I could. And I've got various folders here that have that one. But one thing, these are some really good quality examples of things that I found, because one of my ideas was to make stickers out of the things as an interesting way to distribute her life through the archives in kind of an embodied way. And then with this, collecting all this material, and then back with this final project, which was an installation with zines, where I had a lot of images of her from the archives, as well as text that I wrote that was grappling with the way that her life as a art historian and an administrator, and also kind of integrating some fiction into it. But anyway, all of that to say, I feel like these are two really strong examples of art students that have engaged with archives in creative ways and had outputs that were self-published, both literally zines and kind of more through installation, not a zine per se, but this is the kind of engagement that I really want to continue to solicit from not just art students at VCU, but from students in different disciplines, because you don't have to be an artist to make zines or use archives creatively. They can be worked into a pedagogical approach for any discipline. A recent example of this was a teacher, Professor Mary Thompson from James Madison University, reached out to me because she was teaching a class called Feminism and Zines. So it was really just the perfect fit for VCU's collections. And she ended up coming with her class. They came down for Richmond Zine Fest and also stopped by, and I did a session for them on just, showing our zines and a variety of self-published materials across our collections. So I was really pleased to have the opportunity to work with, and the class was at JMU was cross-listed between English and gender, sexuality, and women's studies. So it definitely helped that the class addressed zines directly, but it was at the same time cool to talk about things like labor in the home, and she actually had her students making and exchanging zines in the class. So it was cool to kind of bring to the forefront the history of zines, whereas with other more creative responses, the zine is kind of a means to an end. But moving forward, I would like to continue to engage with students across disciplines with zines, and I have a few ideas of ways to do that. The first being meeting creators and potential zine creators, as well as artists in general, where they are. So again, going the extra mile to describe the collections really well and provide kind of extra reference support and discussion where things aren't always easily searchable online. And also looking at certain reading room guidelines, like for one, we typically ask researchers to handle one box at a time. But I think when people are handling zines, it can be really valuable to kind of go through a lot of material at once and be able to spread stuff out. And I feel like there's a way to do that while still ensuring that everything gets back into its place. I feel like with both the projects I featured, accumulation and scanning of information was really important, and that obviously, like, it's important to stress to students that it's never going to be an immediate finding what you want or what is relevant to you in the archive is never going to be immediate. So encouraging people to and really look as much as possible, whatever kind of project they're working on. I think research guides would be excellent to develop for zine creation in particular. Then I also think, particularly at VCU and other institutions, depending on what they are able to offer, archives can take more of an active role as publishers or galleries. With Taylor's work, for instance, I think it would be great to offer her an exhibit space in the future to platform that creative work that's been done with archives. And then I think going back to, how zines don't need to have a huge concept in order to exist or to be effective. I think that zines could be integrated into various classes and various disciplines just as a means of response or discussion. And I think about my own graduate school and the way that we do discussion posts. And I think that process really lends itself to zines, and hopefully the embodied nature of actually making a physical thing could help people process and digest content, no matter what kind of course content they're engaging with. And that is all I have. I know that was a little all over the place, but I appreciate y'all sticking along for the ride, and I would love to hear any comments or questions people have. I see one question for Courtney that says, what is public access like for these materials? We are open to the public here at VCU, so you are welcome to, we have a reference email address. If you were to go through the finding aid and find specific boxes that you wanted, you could just reach out to us and let us know when you'd like to come in for an appointment and see them. But we also have walk-in hours Monday through Friday from 12 to 5, and that I can provide the reference email address and more about visiting after this presentation is over, but we are basically open to the public. So, and like I was saying earlier, if you have an idea of something you'd like to see, but you are not sure what it is based on that finding aid that literally just has titles, just email us and we can Zoom, or if you come in walk-in hours, we can just chat in person and help you find some things that are interesting to you. And then Anita has asked, have you seen the collection at Richmond Public Library? And I unfortunately have not. I would really like to, and I also know that Selena Williams, who I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, also played a huge role in establishing that collection there. So if only for the continuity between those two collections, I definitely want to get out there and see that. Awesome, yeah. And I'm interested to look and see how those zines are cataloged, because I think it would really benefit our zine collection to be in our main catalog and to be more searchable. Our book art pieces are with the genre tags, but that's not something we have right now. Okay, cool. I'll have to check it out for sure. Yeah, and I've been meaning to get over to VMFA as well.
Is it okay if I ask a question verbally?
Please, yeah.
Can you hear me okay? I'm on a phone and I'm not sure. It's awesome. So my question isn't zine related specifically, but I definitely felt some empathy with you when you said you went to do research for your own collection and you weren't sure what to request, and you ended up with a whole lot of material to look through being pulled for you. I wondered what you think of the role of the archivist in helping a researcher narrow down the collections to look at, is if they even can do that. I realize that a lot of them may not have the bandwidth, may not have the time professionally to do that. So is there a place for that?
That's a good question. Personally, I'm getting my MLS right now, and I definitely see myself falling more into a tradition of librarianship rather than, I don't see myself becoming an archivist personally, but because my first library job was in access services, I think compared to some of my colleagues here, I feel a stronger commitment towards taking on an active role with users and helping parse things than maybe some other archivists typically do. I think, but a lot of that focuses on in part, rather than saying, I know, I did your research for you and I found that there's probably something relevant in this series. It's more about trying to impart really good searching skills and just empowering people to do that on their own. I feel like that's what's appropriate when there is sufficient, when the collection is sufficiently represented online, which I would say like with our manuscript collections, for the most part, it is, because the finding aid is how it's represented. And I try to I was just doing this yesterday in some email reference, trying to impart to people that you're gonna have to look, like you're probably not going to be able to tell just from the internet what you need. But with other collections, and we have the biggest issue here at VCU with our comic arts collection, and as well as university archives that I mentioned earlier, where it isn't cataloged anywhere. So we can't really expect, so for we have an index that's built on Omeka for our comic books, and it's not as robust as Alma for searching. You really have to know exactly what you want and exactly how the title is spelled in order for it to recall the thing if we have it. And then the university archives are not searchable anywhere. So with those collections, I try to do more to meet the user halfway and hear like what their interests are and see what kind of searching I can do on my side to make at least general recommendations. But I feel like probably even with the manuscript collections, I probably am a little bit more actively involved than archivists typically are. But I feel like that's something that as I spend more time in an archive, I come to appreciate more, that it's an understanding just from the bandwidth of the archivist too, that it needs to be up to the user to search things themselves when possible, because that's not an archivist's main priority. If they're not someone that is like explicitly focused on public services, we need to empower across the board. I believe in empowering users to do their own research as much as possible.
Yeah, I think those are all really great points. Thank you.
Not a question, but I did just want to thank you so much for this presentation. I feel like I learned a lot personally, and I think it was amazing just seeing, especially at the end with the projects that zines and archives can be used for. So I really appreciated you bringing your perspective here.
Thank you. I appreciate you allowing me to share it. And I will maybe work with Sonia and Emily to do this, but I can send my slides or a list of links, as well as information about visiting the VCU archive if you are so inclined.
Thank you, Caroline. Give it maybe just one more minute to see if any last minutes come in.
For sure.
I'll ask a quick question, Caroline, and thank you again so much for your presentation. As far as facilitating in a classroom setting or otherwise, do you have any best practices or ideas that would facilitate such a session?
That's a good question. I think, just thinking about my very recent experience with the class that visited from JMU, offering a wide variety of material with a lot of different entry points and allowing for browsing. One thing that I tried that was just kind of at the last minute, and I had boxes of zines and I had boxes of book art out that were kind of interchangeable, and it was kind of difficult to tell which was which unless you looked really closely. But I had a lot of boxes out, document cases, and where people could pull things out and put a placeholder in. And then there was one table where I just kind of where I pulled individual items out and laid them out without the folders. And it was interesting to see how people interacted with those differently, even though they were the same materials, they were presented differently. There was definitely I think people spent longer with the items that were just out on their own rather than together in a box. With that, it was more about browsing and going through them and seeing how different ones measured up to each other. But I think both of them, getting that, like I said before, getting a sense of just how many zines there are out there and being able to see a big group of them together is important to, I feel like, understand how they're really used. But then also, obviously, just from a teaching standpoint, also making sure that there's that deep engagement where people spend more time looking at one thing closely and making sense of it. I feel like both of those experiences are important. So I think hopefully I do get the chance to do another class like that, but I would probably move forward with presenting them in those different ways so people can have those different experiences.
All right, if there are no further questions, I just want to thank you once again, Caroline, for presenting today, and I want to thank everybody for coming out and joining us on this lovely October day. Only got a little bit left of Archives Month, but I hope you all make the most of it.
Thank you all.